welcome to everyone. We are so happy that you could join us this evening. We are the Master of Educational Technology program at UBC, and this is our anti-racism speaker series. My name is Dr. Carrie Ewart, and I am one of the coordinators for this series, as well as the coordinator for EDI and community outreach, and a faculty member for the Master of Educational Technology program. And joined here with Dr. Samia Khan, who is a faculty member in curriculum and pedagogy and last year's director for MET. So before we begin, I would really like to pay tribute to our land, and as an uninvited and non-Indigenous person, I would like to acknowledge that I recognize that I work and teach and we meet here through UBC's lens on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I acknowledge our traditional hosts and honor their welcome and graciousness to the peoples who seek knowledge here. As an ally in this work, I am committed to the ongoing research and self-education about Indigenous ways and to do the work of decolonizing my practice on a daily basis. I recognize that the profession of education has profound roots in colonial violence and acknowledge my responsibility as a coordinator of EDI and community outreach and graduate studies educational practitioner to meaningfully engage in the ongoing process of disrupting Eurocentric hegemonic and colonial norms, systems, and structures by demonstrating the values of decolonization and anti-racism, by combating the systemic ensure of Indigenous peoples' values and ways of life and knowing and knowledges of ways of doing. So decolonizing takes time and effort, and we ask all of the participants here today that you share your own land acknowledgement if you wish to do so in the chat area, and to continue to decolonize your work and practice about being mindful about the purpose of our land acknowledgement as a means to recognize Indigenous peoples, cultures, traditions, territories, spaces, and materials as a means of transforming dialogue into action. Now, the Master of Educational Technology program is a graduate program in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia, and it educates professionals on the use and the impact of digital learning technologies. The purpose of this anti-racism speaker series is to acknowledge the commitment that every individual has to inclusivity and to addressing systemic racism, with a focus on anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-people of color racism. This series seeks to identify the responsibility that educators and leaders have to facilitating and supporting anti-racist approaches and strategies for truth, redress, and reconciliation within their practice to enhance and transform learning environments and learning cultures, with a specific directive being digital technologies and anti-racism. Presenters discuss racism and tools to support equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization in this digital age. Now, we are doing something a little different with this anti-racism speaker series, and that is our call to action, that we are committed to a follow-up to each of our presentations of this speaker series with this call to action challenge. So we invite, and we will give you more information about it after, but we invite that all of our attendees try to make one change this month, this day, moving forward, and share with us next steps to this presentation. So you are going to hear a profound and amazing talk today about systemic racism in policing and next steps to the way things are moving forward from a human rights lens from the amazing Commissioner Kasari Govender. And we ask that you too eradicate this racism through your actions and moving this dialogue into action. So without further ado, I would really like to welcome our Commissioner, BC Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari Govender, and we'll let everybody know that in the chat area, you will be able to find a Slido link, and this Slido link will allow you to ask questions throughout the entire conversation that we have today. And then the Commissioner will take up these questions at the end for you. So welcome, Commissioner Kasari Govender. We're so happy to have you here with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And thank you as well for the invitation to be here. Thank you to all of you for making the time to join a talk at the very end of your day. I hope to make it worth your while and interesting enough to justify it. Before I continue, I do want to acknowledge that I'm also joining you from the unceded and traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As the descendant of migrants and settlers, my ancestors come from India via South Africa and throughout Western Europe. And I am so grateful to the people who have cared for this land and waters in such a way as that allows many of us to be here physically, and also for us to gather virtually in this space. But I'm also aware that our territorial acknowledgements need to couple that gratitude with a sense of responsibility. And that responsibility is certainly something that sits heavy and importantly with me as Human Rights Commissioner, really guides our work as an office. And I think it rests a responsibility on not only my shoulders and all of our shoulders, but the University of British Columbia as well, being located very squarely on Musqueam lands. The research and recommendations that I'm here to talk about today contains some stark reminders about the ongoing impact of colonization on Indigenous people. And I want to acknowledge that that really influences, as I said, not only what our work, but really what I'm going to talk to you about today in the research that we conducted. And an ongoing piece of work for us is to integrate that knowledge, not only through the outcomes of what we do, trying to work to promote and protect Indigenous people's rights and undo the impact of colonization, but also to do our work differently. So I'm going to try to talk about both process and outcome in our conversation today. Oh yes, sorry, thank you. I forgot to tell you to forward the slides. You can actually go to the next one. For those who may not be oh, actually, sorry, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview. I'm going to start with background on our office and on human rights more generally. And I'll introduce you then to some of the work that we've done on policing, provide an overview of how, again, this process part of how we approached our work in this area, including building on some previous work that we've done on data collection, in the context of human rights. And finally, I will speak to our findings and recommendations about how to address systemic racism in policing. For the latter half of our time together, I'm hoping to have enough time for conversation and to answer questions. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may not be familiar with our work, excuse me, my office is fairly new as we just rounded the corner from our third year in existence. Between 2002 and 2019, BC was the only province without a Human Rights Commission. When our office was established in 2019, it was done in a fairly unique way. So my role as Commissioner is set up as an independent officer of the legislature, so that my appointment and the budget of our office is outside the political process or control of the government of the day. And is uniquely positioned as a government, as a public institution, with a mandate to promote and protect human rights, including by acting as a watchdog over the government. So that's where our independence comes in. Our role is really as a critic. Well, for 17 years, BC trailed the rest of the country in the world of human rights institutions because we didn't have a commission. Now we are the only jurisdiction in Canada with an independent public body tasked with dismantling systemic inequalities. The office has come into being against the backdrop of human rights becoming increasingly precarious in our communities. 6 months after our doors opened, the pandemic hit. During our current inquiry into hate during the pandemic, we heard about how the rise of populism, coupled with the fear and isolation of living in a pandemic, culminated in the rise of hate during this time. 2 months after the pandemic began, George Floyd was murdered, sparking the largest racial protests in the US since the Civil Rights Movement and igniting a global reckoning with racism. In May 2021, Kamloops to Secwépemc confirmed that the remains of 215 children were found on the grounds of the Kamloops Residential School and the unmarked graves of children who died in residential schools continue to be uncovered. This, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg, really, with the human rights issues that our province is facing. The list of human rights issues goes on, but so does the work of human rights. The job of my office is to address the root causes of inequality, discrimination, and injustice in BC by shifting laws, policies, practices, and cultures. Next slide, please. So turning then to how policing factors into our human rights landscape. Next slide, please. In the face of widespread critique of police for racial profiling and disproportionate uses of force, there is a growing interest in challenging and changing our dominant model of how we promote community safety. As you might know, in late 2020, early 2021, the legislature of BC appointed the Special Committee on Reforming the Police Act, which was a legislative committee looking into policing and charged with doing a broad inquiry into potential reforms to the Police Act and more generally to policing in the province. Excuse me. I appeared before the committee in February of 2021 and then submitted our written submissions in November of last year. To support our submissions, we commissioned a large research report, which gathered data about the disproportionate impacts of certain policing practices on Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people. Next slide, please. Before I go any further, though, into the work of policing, I want to speak briefly to the importance and the role of data collection in doing this work. In September of 2020, we released a report entitled Demographic Data Collection in BC, the Grandmother Perspective. This report called for the comprehensive collection of demographic data, where such data is required to address systemic inequalities. The grandmother perspective to data collection, which I first learned from Gwen Phillips, BC First Nations data governance champion. And she talked about how government should collect data much as a grandmother would collect information about her family. That collection, the use of that data would really be motivated by a desire to better care for them, rather than to exercise control from more of a big brother kind of mentality. Disaggregated demographic data are informed based on our information, based on different aspects of our identity. So for example, it can be broken down by race or gender or so on. And the statistics that emerge from the collection of that data help us understand how programs, policies, practices impact different groups of people differently, which we can then map onto existing social inequalities and begin to see the patterns of how our public policies impact and inform systemic inequalities and work to change that. Following our report on data, the BC government introduced new legislation to facilitate data collection and use for the purposes of addressing systemic racism, and largely adopted our recommendations for change. While Statistics Canada census already collects disaggregated data in relation to the general population, the new law, the Anti-Racism Data Legislation, or Data Act rather, will facilitate the collection of such data in relation to government policies, such as healthcare and so on. Eventually, this data collection process will be extended to policing, but it isn't yet. So comparing, as I mentioned, comparing the statistical side that we know of the general population to the data collected in the impact of government policies and practices can reveal patterns and inequalities, and then can help us to identify these policy changes that we can make. All this work is really premised on this idea of we can't act on what we don't know, or what people can deny. We need that evidence to be undeniable to take action. At the same time, we need to safeguard against some of the harms that can be perpetuated by the collection and use of data, the stereotypes that can be reinforced. And the way forward on this, in my view, is to embed meaningful community governance over data. This means that the government excuse me, takes the guidance and direction of a community governance committee. They have called it something different in the final as a realization of the legislation, but essentially is a governance committee, and in where First Nations data is concerned, to have nation-to-nation agreements to govern the use of that data. We relied on findings from this report, from the grandmother perspective report, to both shape our process and our recommendations related to policing. We gathered extensive demographic data from policing files, sought the guidance of impacted communities and what we did with their data, and ultimately used the data to support strong recommendations for policing reforms to address systemic inequities. So turning then to the what we did on policing, more into the how. We've got a little taste of it here, but I'll take you to the next slide, please. And then the next one. Thank you. In order to prepare our submissions and the attached research report that we put into the legislative committee, we conducted consultations and engaged in a great deal of research. Between the fall of 2020 and the summer of 2021, we spoke to 22 community and academic experts through both roundtables and one-on-one consultations. We followed closely the work of Ontario and Nova Scotia Human Rights Commissions, which had conducted similar research, although very limited to the impact in major cities. So the Ontario research focuses on systemic inequalities in the Toronto Police Force and Halifax, and the Nova Scotia Commission focused on what was happening in Halifax. In early of 2021, we asked all police services in the province to tell us more about what type of data they collected, so we could kind of hone our data request. I then used my powers under the Human Rights Code to make detailed data requests to 5 police services. So I have the power under the legislation to compel bodies to produce evidence, and I relied on that power to get evidence from the Vancouver Police Department, the Nelson Police Department, and then 3 RCMP detachments, Surrey, Duncan, and Prince George. So we requested demographic data for a 10-year period on mental health, well-being checks, arrests, detentions, and strip searches. Next slide, please. We then commissioned Dr. Scott Wortley, who is a researcher in Ontario with extensive experience working with police data to identify these kinds of trends around racial profiling. We commissioned him to analyze the data received, and as a result, he produced what we think might be the largest study of policing ever done in Canada. As I mentioned, the data shows significant racial disparities that impacting Indigenous and Black people, and to a lesser extent, Arab, West Asian people, and Hispanic people. Next slide, please. So relying on the grandmother perspective report that I mentioned a moment ago, we have committed to using this perspective in our research on demographic data, which means we've committed to ensuring that demographic data, such as the policing data we're here talking about today, is not released or used in a way that doesn't accord with the views of the communities who are most impacted or whose data it actually is. So in this case, we briefed affected communities and Indigenous nations and organizations to seek their views on the release of the data report. We also did seek to meet with every nation whose territory overlaps with the 5 police jurisdictions we were looking at, so far more than 5 nations because there's overlapping jurisdiction. We committed to not publishing the information pertaining to that community if we didn't get their go-ahead, their consent to release it. And in the result, we were encouraged and supported to release the data from all the communities and nations who participated in that process. Turning to the next slide, please. And so that takes us to the research report on the data from police forces. Yes, next slide, thank you. So this is a quote from Dr. Scott Wortley, the academic who we commissioned to do the analysis. And I think it really sums up his findings. So we'll start here. The results of this examination, he says, are disturbing. Indigenous and Black people are either grossly or significantly overrepresented in British Columbia arrest statistics, and a great deal of police activity involves people living with mental health issues. Indigenous, Black, and Arab West Asian people are also significantly overrepresented in these types of police interactions. Racial disparities likely result from a combination of higher rates of offending, police bias, and civilian reporting practices. Regardless of the cause, the overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color in police statistics is a problem that can no longer be ignored. Both government and police officials must make the reduction of racial disparities a priority. Next slide, please. So I want to break down some of the findings from this research. There are, a number of data caveats, and I won't get into all of them, but I think some of the important pieces to draw out here are that Indigenous men, where we looked here at arrests and chargeable incidents, really arrests when people are detained. It was chargeable incidents is just another form of another term that's used in the policing world. Indigenous men here this data shows that Indigenous men are over 17 times more likely to be arrested by the Vancouver Police Department than their presence in the population would predict. That's over 17 times more likely to be arrested than if they were arrested according to their population. Black people are highly overrepresented in arrest statistics in 3 of the 5 jurisdictions we looked at: Vancouver, Surrey, and Nelson. Hispanic and Arab West Asian people are also overrepresented in many police jurisdictions. It is important to note that Indigenous and Black people are far more overrepresented in public disorder offenses and administration of justice charges than charges involving serious violence. Next slide, please. So on the mental health side, we also saw that Indigenous and Black people were are highly overrepresented in mental health incidents involving police. For example, in Nelson, Black people are 4.7 times more likely to appear in mental health incidents involving the police than their presence in the general population would predict. Next slide, please. The last one on strip searches is a bit misleading. So I included it here because it was part of the study, but it doesn't tell us a lot. And that's because strip search numbers were dramatically lower in all 5 of these jurisdictions than they are anywhere else in the country that's been studied. And there was no reasons for that yet that we could figure out. And so this was such a small sample size, it was difficult to draw many conclusions from it. Next slide, please. These are far more than numbers, of course, of all those numbers I just showed you. Those statistics, of course, represent real people and include real harm to people, including mental health impacts, physical injuries and death, and both immediate impacts on someone's lives, but also intergenerational trauma that flows from that. The people who are directly impacted by the policing practices we're talking about today are mothers and sons, people who live in luxury homes and without homes, people driving to work, people seeking healthcare. The experiences of those most directly impacted by systemic racism and policing were really at the heart of this work. And I don't want all the numbers to undermine that central fact that these are real people's experiences. If we could go back a slide. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, the gender one was perfect. Dr. Wortley also made some important findings on the intersection between race and gender. So the research literature generally tends to indicate that women are significantly underrepresented in police arrest statistics. But this piece of research showed that Indigenous women are really the glaring exception to that general rule. Compared to their presence in the general population, Indigenous women are grossly overrepresented in arrests involving the Vancouver Police Department and significantly overrepresented in arrests involving both the Surrey and the Prince George RCMP. So, for example, Indigenous women are more than 15 times more likely to be arrested in Vancouver than a white woman. Next slide, please. While examining the causes of these significant racial disparities was beyond the scope of the research we did, The quote from Professor Wortley pointed out these three theses, these three guesses about what's happening here. And I want to draw them out a little bit because I think it's important to the overall findings here. So the bias theory, in which the overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color in police statistics is attributed to discriminatory treatment by the police and others in the criminal justice system. Discriminatory treatment could include higher police surveillance of Indigenous and Black people in communities, as well as discriminatory exercise of officer discretion. The civilian bias theory is the idea that racial bias of complainants or victims also can increase the likelihood that incidents involving Indigenous and Black people are reported to the police. So that requires an analysis of who's calling 911, who's reporting these offenses, and what's their motivation or bias in that. And then finally, the offending thesis, in which higher rates of offending by Indigenous, Black, and people of color are attributed to a complex array of factors, including colonialism and slavery, rather than being attributed to inherent or behavioral tendencies. So all three of these, no matter which way you look at it, are the result of colonialism and systemic racism. While it's not easy to isolate the causes of the significant disparities in police outcomes, we have clear data that shows that, at least in some circumstances, the problem lies in the bias of police officers. For example, the most notable statistical disproportionality in the information from the Vancouver Police Department is that Indigenous people make up 23% of all proactive street checks. So that's the carding issue that we know from Ontario, or here we refer to it as street checks. While we also know that 55% of street checks involving Indigenous people were the officer checking on the person's well-being or safety, even accounting for checks were conducted for a person's well-being, street checks continue to disproportionately impact Indigenous people and can result in the harms that flow that we've talked about, regardless of intent. And regardless of the cause, police forces, alongside other actors in the justice system and really other actors across government, excuse me, have an obligation to proactively tackle systemic inequalities that impact Indigenous people and Black people and other racialized groups. This is what human rights and constitutional law protections for substantive equality require. Inequities too often are revealed through the exercise of police power, and therefore police bear a significant burden to address them. Next slide, please. So I'll turn then to our key findings. Next slide. Our recommendations for police reform were really based on these four key findings: that policing in this country is rooted in colonial mandates to control Indigenous people in order to bring settlers onto the land; that the primary purpose of policing now is to promote and protect community safety; that discriminatory policing undermines rather than protects communities, or conversely, that equity is essential to community safety; and finally, that police reform is both possible and essential. We make these key findings that the time for debate about whether, I should say, I think I used the word finding before. It's really, those were our premises on which we built this work. These are the key findings, which is that the time for debate about whether systemic racism exists in policing is over, particularly but not exclusively as it relates to Indigenous and Black people in British Columbia, and it's time to act. The analysis of data from police services confirm what communities themselves have long been saying, that these racial disparities are not necessarily only the product of bias in policing practices, that there's systemic racism in many systems, which leads to the over-criminalization of marginalized and racialized folks, and that police forces, alongside other actors in the justice system and across government, as I mentioned before, have an obligation to proactively tackle systemic inequalities. Next slide, please. I'll end by, I'll talk about our recommendations and then just end on a few points about where we're at now. As a starting point, we recommend that the provincial government work with Indigenous people on a government-to-government basis on legislative amendments to the Police Act, and provide funding for Indigenous people to be partners in police reform. We recommend that the collection of race-based and other demographic data for the purpose of addressing systemic racism or systemic discrimination more generally in policing be rolled out in meaningful consultation with community. We recommend that police are detasked as mental health first responders, excuse me, as well as detasked from other social service and health related functions. Detasking the police requires redelegating some tasks undertaken by police to agencies that are better suited because of their mandate, their expertise, their cultural alignment, their effectiveness, that those folks are better placed to address many issues. And that this redelegation of tasks necessitates redelegation of public funds to ensure that health, housing, and other socioeconomic needs are met. Key steps to detasking police as first responders to mental health crises. Key steps include detasking police as first responders to mental health crises, substance use crises, and homelessness, and reallocating that funding, as I mentioned, to healthcare and other services. It also entails building up educational supports to replace the role of police liaison officers in schools, which I'll get back to in just a moment. However, those are only a few examples of detasking, and in our submissions, we asked the government to do a comprehensive review of policing activities to identify all the tasks that should be reassigned to civilian or community-led agencies. We have also called for a ban on arbitrary police stops. There has been some progress made on police stops, but we know that the police stops that are left continue to disproportionately impact racialized communities. So we continue our calls for reform. And in particular, we detailed significant reforms to the policing standard that governs stops in order to take out to reduce the exercise of discretion, ensure accountability for police actions, and ensure information is collected only for the purposes of accountability. We also make a number of key recommendations in relation to police accountability. I won't detail them here, but we included in that echoing the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry, the National Inquiry, who called for the creation of an Indigenous oversight body for complaints about police conduct. So I want to end today by spending a moment on where we're at now with these issues. We, as I mentioned, issued these recommendations in November alongside many other community-based organizations, First Nations leaders, public agencies, and the legislative committee responded with their report in late April. And in that report, they do echo a number of important recommendations that many of us made, including ensuring that Indigenous people are involved in the drafting of the proposed revisions to the legislation. It also included requiring police to collect disaggregated data in service of systemic inequality and establishing a single independent civilian-led oversight agency for police. Right now, there are a multitude of options that create a great deal of confusion and obfuscate access to justice in this context. Importantly, the committee also addressed the call to detask the police through, and I'll just actually take you to the next slide, please. Thank you. Through the recommendation that you see here, which is to create and appropriately fund a continuum of response to mental health, addictions, and other complex social issues with a focus on prevention and community-led responses. In my view, this recommendation does, have significant implications for the future of community safety if it was implemented. But you might note that the recommendation does not specifically detask police from these same services. And it doesn't require the redirecting of funds from police who are currently dealing with some of these complex social issues to organizations that are better placed. I think it will take significant provincial and municipal leadership to move forward. But as we saw yesterday in the provincial announcement about a major new investment in the RCMP, we seem to be moving in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, the committee did not address the calls to action on school liaison officers, dedicated Indigenous-led police oversight, or removing the exercise of discretion in police-conducted street checks. As you may know, there is a heated debate in Vancouver unfolding as we speak about whether the Vancouver School Board will be introducing school liaison officers, excuse me, back into schools after last year's vote to end the program. And I sent a letter off to the School Trustees Association this afternoon, which will be made public tomorrow, really drawing attention to the human rights considerations with school liaison officers. We've spent a number of months briefing ministry staff, police boards, police chiefs, and trying to push forward the recommendations that the legislative committee made, as well as the broader recommendations that we made. Despite these recent setbacks, I do still have much motivation and hope that we can continue this work, and that's exactly what we will do. So that takes me to the end of my presentation today, and I really look forward to hearing any questions, discussion that you are interested in having now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely so insightful, so amazing to hear from a human rights lens. Thank you to Commissioner Govender for this amazing talk, unpacking this from an anti-racist lens, but also from addressing systemic racism and policing from this human rights lens. I would like to now pass it over to Dr. Samia Khan, who is going to, with that Slido link that you were given, is going to address the many, many questions, Commissioner, that have been asked. Obviously, this intrigued a lot of conversation, and we'll try to get to as many as we can within our time limits here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ewert, and I'm happy to support the anti-racism series with sharing the questions for Commissioner Govender. Commissioner, we've got a number of fascinating questions for you, revolving around both local and provincial level politics and data disaggregation. The first one is, how will you be able to address these challenges when the chief of the VPD has not admitted to systemic racism in the organization?
It's a great question, and certainly one that we continue to grapple with. I was asked by, or my office was asked by the Healtsick Nation and Maxwell Johnson and his granddaughter, who were the grandfather and grandchild of that were handcuffed at the BMO office. And this seems like a different answer, but I'll get to, it's directly related. Maxwell and his granddaughter were arrested at the BMO office. You may remember when they presented their treaty cards, the bank called the VPD in because they seemed to, for some reason, suspected a fraud. And the VPD showed up, handcuffed both of the grandfather and his 12-year-old grandchild, and without asking them any questions. So that incident it was obviously very traumatizing to the people involved. And Max and Torianne, his granddaughter, brought a complaint to the tribunal. That complaint was settled between the Vancouver Police Board and the Healtsick Nation, who was representing and working with the grandfather and granddaughter, and they're in the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. This is the story being shared now. And when in the course of that settlement agreement, which has been made public, they agreed to make some systemic changes. The Vancouver Police Board agreed to make some systemic changes to the Vancouver Police Force, and approached me, the Healtsick Nation, and the other plaintiffs approached me in my office to provide an audit role to that. I was privileged to be able to go to Bella Bella for a ceremony that was supposed to be an apology ceremony because the officers didn't show up. It became what they called an uplifting ceremony. It was a great honor to be there, and had a chance to hear a little bit from the VPD as well about how they would approach this. Many people in the community in Bella Bella called attention to exactly the issue that this question is calling attention to, which is how can we take these actions if they won't even admit it? And I think that is going to be a key piece of how this unfolds. And it unfolded in a very real way, in the sense that the two officers who were involved in the incident were asked to come and participate in this apology ceremony and did not come. The police chief did, as well as the police board. So it was good to see some institutional commitment evident to perhaps address these issues and realize this agreement, but certainly some limitations there. I do think the legality of this agreement will move things forward. So I can make recommendations, but I can't bind anybody to act. I can say this agreement that they came to on their own terms does bind them to act, to reform their complaint process, to change some educational pieces for police officers, and there's a couple other related pieces. So I think that will move the needle regardless of the individuals in those roles, or at least I hope it will. Long answer to that question, sorry.
No worries. Thank you for sharing that information, and also for sharing the role of your new office, your powers, and the report. Our next question is around the response of First Nation groups to the grandmother perspective framing and the report itself. Can you elaborate a little bit about their responses?
Sure. Has been very positive. As I say, we worked directly with the nations on whose territories we were working, and not everybody wanted to participate in the process, but where they did, and many did, they were enthusiastic about the process, gave us really important feedback that informed the direction we took it and the recommendations we made. So we had a very useful collaborative feedback there. And also we have a memorandum of understanding with the First Nations Leadership Council. So we were able to, they were very supportive of this report, and they promoted it with their communications. The Grand Chief spoke very passionately about the importance of implementing the recommendations. So I was pleased to say they're on board as well.
Mm. Thank you. And it's fascinating to hear that your office is so new regarding, sort of the production of reports. And some of the questions are related to the powers that your office holds. Good data, but what are your powers to force real change in police departments regarding systemic racism? I think you've addressed a little bit of that, but if you want to share more.
Sure. So I'll get back to the powers. There was another piece that just occurred to me from the last question, which is just to say that when the government, as I mentioned, accepted most of our recommendations of how to draft the data legislation that from the grandmother perspective report, and they ended up co-drafting that legislation with First Nations. So there was a process that was really, I think, positively experienced about how that actually rolled out as well. So I just wanted to add that to the last question. In terms of my powers into the legislation, so as I mentioned, I don't have the power to enforce the recommendations. What I do is have the power to order the production of evidence. So require bodies like the RCMP or police or others to produce the documents that we need in order to draw our conclusions. And then I have the power to make them report publicly and report to me, and to make that public about how well they're doing at regular intervals in responding to the recommendations that we've made. So that's another mechanism that's not, again, I can't force them to do it, but I can force them to tell everybody how they're doing and moving those forward. It's a similar kind of power to, and I have a similar role to the ombudsperson, the representative for children and youth, the auditor general. We're all, there's 9 of us that are officers of the legislature, and we have quite different roles, but similar powers in some ways. So if you're familiar with any of those.
Yes, thank you. Earlier on in the talk, you talked about your office contributing to culture change, and that is a very challenging process that unfolds over a long period of time, and understanding that you haven't been in the role, or this office hasn't been around for all that long. But in looking at impact pathways and how you're going to eventually contribute to culture change, the next question is around making recommendations. How will you be able to ensure change in a tight-lipped, protected police organization? The logistics of that are impossible.
Certainly there's some uphill battles, and different police forces seem to have different receptivity to making change and express that in different ways. I was quite surprised actually at the level of interest in police, in some police boards across the province. The Association of Police Boards invited me to come and speak and present about the recommendations. The Vancouver Police Department individually invited me to come and speak to the chief and to others, and to their African Advisory Committee, or People of African Descent Advisory Committee. So there was more interest from the police forces themselves than what I had anticipated, to be honest. So that was a positive step. There's also been a lot of resistance. So even though I have the power to make orders, there's been some significant resistance from some police forces. So I won't be Pollyanna about that. But I do think that there is some power in bringing things into the sunlight. And that's where the real teeth are, is that I can order folks to produce evidence and report back on how well they're doing with change. And there is some power in that, which really lies in all of us, right? It's my job to make it public, and then it's all of our job to engage in those conversations, to continue the story, not let it be a one headline and gone, and to include it in our educational environments, but also in our dinner table conversations alongside whatever roles we might have in changing policy. I do want to say we have done other pieces on changing kind of hearts and minds, shifting cultures, generally with the public, which we've run some public awareness campaigns. But that's a different puzzle than I think the one that's being asked about changing culture in police forces.
Thank you. And you talked about school liaison officers. The next question, and will be relevant to our educators, especially here in the audience. Policing in schools has been debated in our recent municipal elections. What recommendation does your office make on this topic?
So we commissioned some research, or grant funded, I should say, some research on school liaison officers, of the research that would apply to BC when we were writing our report to better understand what's already out there. And we found that there's very little research in the Canadian context. The American context, there is quite extensive research showing the damage done to Black families and young people, other racialized families and young people that have officers in their schools, both in terms of their sense of safety, but also some very tangible pieces around the discipline that they face. And there's studies showing that they are more often disciplined in that context, where there's by officers than their non-racialized, their white counterparts. So I think we can extrapolate much of that evidence here. The reason I'm going into the evidence behind it and answering the question is that my recommendation to municipalities is, who are making this decision, is to cancel and SLO programs unless and until you have strong evidence that there is a positive impact from SLO programs, putting the interests of Indigenous people, Black people, and other racialized people at the center of that analysis. So because we didn't have the research here, it was hard to point to exactly this context, and our criminal justice context is very different than the US. Not perfect by any means, don't mean to make it sound that much better, but very different. And so unless and until they're able to produce that evidence, they need to cancel them. And importantly, much of the justification for SLOs, which I was fascinated to find out about as we did this work, is that they coach teams, that they provide counseling, that they provide educational services on, healthy boundary setting, things that you think this does not have to be provided by a police officer in a school. What if we properly funded education providers to coach teams? What if we properly funded people to do that, so that school boards didn't have to turn to the police to answer these calls to action. So that's the other piece of the recommendation, is that adequate funding should go towards all these other services instead of having this strange connection between our school liaison officers and non-policing services.
I'd like to turn to questions revolving around data and disaggregation. We have a number of those, and you talked about that as part of a real big contribution of your report. How do you suggest differentiating for different groups to address all safety and individual needs?
Not sure if I totally understand that question. Let me see if I can pull it up so that I can read it, or maybe someone can drop it into the chat for me.
Absolutely, I can do that. And Dr. Khan, right after, Yvonne Brown has a question as well.
Thank you. I put it into the chat, the full question.
It's not showing up for me.
Okay.
Can you read it out to me one more time? Oh, there we go.
I
There we
just
go.
put it in again. There we go.
Who's going?
Um,
May I speak or do I wait for turn? Or are we allowed to speak?
Of course, you are always allowed to speak. I think Commissioner Govender is just going to address the question that appeared in the chat right now. And then
Okay.
right after, I would love to welcome your question if that works for you.
Thank you. That does work.
Excellent.
Thank you. I look forward to your question. In terms of the question in the chat, I'm not sure if what's being asked is about shorter term solutions, knowing that addressing systemic racism as a whole is a large and sometimes unfathomable task. So if that's what we're asking, I think there are practical ways that we can start to chip away at the problem, partly through changing laws and policies. So we might not change behavior right away, but if we can do things like, for example, on the police stop example is useful here. So what we know is that it's in the exercise of discretion, the officer's discretion, and the allowances made for in the police stop policy that allow for arbitrary stops. They don't disallow for that. Now, there's some good reason for that. While it might sound fairly alarming, that police can just stop people whenever they feel like it, and that's what arbitrary can mean. It can be useful for things like, or potentially could be useful for things like traffic stops. So for drunk driving, it allows them to stop every fifth car or whatever. But there are some good solutions to allow them still to do the kind of randomized stops where there's traffic on traffic violations. And some jurisdictions have developed some systems where they can decide internally, we're going to stop every third car and then every fifth car, and have a system to differentiate that, so they're not unconsciously looking for the black driver to stop, right? So it's about, well, we are not going to change every officer's perception from the start. What we can do is change the policy to not allow them to make arbitrary stops and to take out the exercise of police discretion. So they actually have to follow the policy, and they can't justify it with, well, I'm allowed to stop people arbitrarily. I had a sense that that person was, had drugs in their car somewhere, and it takes us away from the offense of driving while black or driving while Indigenous, that perception that officers will just exercise their discretion arbitrarily in order to have a disproportionate impact on racialized people. So basically what I'm saying is, I think there's some shorter term solutions that will chip away at the larger issues of systemic racism through law and policy change.
I'd like to invite Yvonne Brown for her question. Thank you for your patience.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. From where I am, it's 9 o'clock. I welcome this presentation, and I'm pleased to hear it, that its work is being done in BC. I will introduce myself and tell you why I'm participating in this. My name is Yvonne Brown, and I spent 39 years in BC in the education system. And in the 80s, I was part of the Vancouver School Board's anti-racism policy, which is now defunct and revisited. I was also part of a public education program for the Vancouver Police Department in 1992, and I have a record of it. At a time when the Black community felt that there was a disproportionate number of Black and colored youth who were being apprehended by the police for hanging out on Granville Street and forgot what the other street is, on a Friday afternoon. Some of them included my own son. And I was forced to intervene and have a conversation, and more than that. But I want to ask you, you mentioned colonization and systemic racism. And my question is, I don't think people understand what that means. What does it mean when we allude to colonialism? History is not taught in schools. We ourselves in the public and the police departments need to study the history of policing. Why was policing invented? And it goes back to the Royal Constabulary Force that was invented in England to police the working class there, and transported after emancipation to police the Black people who were newly emancipated. And when we look in Canada, it's the history of the RCMP to police the bodies of First Nations people. And people need to revisit that history in order to understand what we are calling systemic racism. Because without the history of the founding of those institutions and looking at their original mandate, I don't think the depth of the problems and the issues that we are discussing really help the officers and everyone to understand such terms, such phenomena as unconscious bias and stereotyping and stuff. Let's leave culture aside for a while, because after, my experience in dealing with this stuff in Vancouver is that after we have the social functions and have the samosas and the jerk chicken and all the foods and the music and stuff, we still meet the racism with our children in the schools, with the policing on the street and everything. And the police are human beings. And we need to place them within the whole history of why all of us are here and how we are differently positioned in the society and how we can help ourselves. I am quite unhappy with any discussion that does not involve a history of how colonization and the police departments work, and a thorough revision of the police curriculum, because they go to school and they get trained. And when I look at the curriculum, what they're being taught in the police schools, the kind of targeting of the First Nations and the Black people as the possible criminals, the profiles, such terms as the typical this and the typical that. I think we need to have that. Policies are important, don't get me wrong. And the laws are made to make us do what we wouldn't do voluntarily. But we need a common conversation around the history of colonization and how racism features into it. So I really applaud your research, because it introduces into the public discourse in BC your findings. And that hard data is really important for part of the discussion, but the discussion needs to go beyond that. And I'm glad to see that you've joined Nova Scotia and Ontario in this endeavor. So thank you very much. It's not a question. I just needed to say something about the importance of understanding what we mean by colonization and structural racism in relation to law enforcement. Thank you very much.
Yvonne, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience in this area, which is obviously much longer than mine. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I completely agree with you. I won't answer more now because we're over time, or engage in it more now, but it was a key premise of how we did our work, was what is the original function of policing in this country, was not just to police Indigenous bodies, but to remove land from Indigenous peoples. So I absolutely agree with you, and thank you for the work that you've done in this area.
You're welcome.
I think Yvonne Brown's comments are a call to education and very much speak to the role of education curriculum in police matters and in anti-racism and decolonization. So I thank you very much for your special comments about what we as educators can do and should do as part of the history lessons that are necessary to be learned. I'd like now to turn the conversation over to Dr. Ewert for final remarks. And we have a host of questions that we weren't able to get to, and it wasn't possible to do so. And we hope that Commissioner Govender, we can send those questions to you in the chance that you might be able to respond to them in a different venue. And over to you, Dr. Ewert.
Thank you so much. And I realize we've gone over time, and thank you so much, Commissioner, for waiting online and really wholeheartedly addressing these questions, as I think it created some amazing dialogue. And we ask our participants to continue this dialogue and really consider the call to action so that we can move this. And Dr. Khan, you came up with some ideas for that, and Commissioner, with your recommendations in doing so. And thank you for all of those who asked these questions. We do want to thank Edith Lando, because with their funding, we are able to move this forward in a digital context and creating learning resources for everybody who is available. And I see in the chat area right now that the link for the call to action has been placed. So as a final thank you and farewell, Commissioner Kasari Govender, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for this amazing reporting this data. I think that it evokes so much conversation and important dialogue and movement to action. So it has been such a pleasure to host you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And thank you to all of you for participating and attending. Great questions.
Thank you. And thank you to our attendees. We are so happy that you continue to join us for our anti-racism speaker series, and to our Met Community Coordinator, Helena, for your involvement, and Dr. Samia Khan. Thank you.